All right. Well, thank you for joining us this morning. I'm Robbie Knock, and I'm pleased to host you on behalf of Art Center College of Design. Before we get started, I have a few words of introduction. When I first encountered a new reality and the ideas that Jonas and Jonathan Salk chart in the book, I found them to inspire a type of interdisciplinary, long-term thinking with a real relevance across design and innovation contexts, and a focus on sustainable, equitable global outcomes. Since 2018, I believe that the spark contained in the text is all the more relevant, providing an essential lens for understanding the global transformation which has accelerated during the pandemic. The observations and methods in the book are very useful for untangling short-term problems and guiding thinking for teams focused on changing the future. Jonathan today will be joined by Miya Osaki and Stephanie Yanchinski, who will highlight through their work some of the ways in which a new reality's observations can help us fine-tune our path in design, science, healthcare, and education, highlighting the possibilities for a new type of collaborative innovation that takes the long view as its starting point. So our structure today will have 4 parts. We will start with personal introductions by each of the speakers. Jonathan will then share key aspects of a new reality in a few slides, leading us into a moderated conversation with Stephanie and Miya, followed by 15 minutes for audience questions. But please submit your questions throughout. We'll do our best to address those in the conversation and make sure that we focus on those areas that you really are interested in. And we will be recording this conversation today, and we'll have a link for you all to refer to after we conclude. So we'll send that via email. And with that, I'd like to hand it off to Jonathan, Stephanie, and Miya for introductions. Jonathan, if you'd kick us off, that would be great.
Sure. It's really great to be here, Robbie. So, and thank you for arranging this. I'm Jonathan Salk. Actually, I work, my day job as a psychiatrist. I have a private practice and I do some teaching at UCLA. And I'm really looking forward to having a chance to go over the ideas of the book, because basically we are at a really important transition in our history and our evolution, from a time when things were growing consistently to a time where things are slowing down, and the adaptations we need to make can actually be very positive and salutary for our species. And I'll turn it over to Miya.
Hi, great. Thank you so much, Robbie and Art Center and Jonathan and Stephanie. I'm excited to be here. I'm Miya Osaki. I'm a co-founder and partner in a company called Diagram. We are a healthcare design company. We are a studio that focuses only on looking at how to improve care experiences for people. I'm also the chair of a department at School of Visual Arts called Design for Social Innovation. And I'm so interested and excited today because I too have felt in my bones for the last couple of years that we're in a shift. And over the last year, just seeing how things quickly moved into a new space, we've been just asking ourselves, and I've been asking myself in all dimensions, is how can we care more for our communities, for each other, for the environment, and our health more broadly. So I'm very excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm Stephanie Yanchinski. I'm the Director of Entrepreneurial Programs at Caltech. And like everybody on this call, I'm concerned about the pace of change and how we can not follow it, but lead it actually, especially in clean tech and sustainability. My job at Caltech is to, perhaps for the first time at Caltech, envisage and then implement entrepreneurial education programs. And in our discovery, we are feeling that for a science institution like Caltech, it has to be as broad as possible. And that fits in very well with the concepts that we're going to be talking about today. My own personal trajectory started as a scientist, but I found that I wanted actually to have more of an impact, so I moved into communications. But then I found my true passion, which was in helping academic companies get a better start than they were, faster and with more success. So I've been doing that for the past 20 years. The most recent initiative that is connected to the Resnick Sustainability Institute that I'm part of is running a program called the Rocket Fund. We found that in working with almost, well, in fact, over 1,000 entrepreneurs, that what was missing and where a lot of the companies died and failed was in after emerging from academia and before they had a product that they could sell to a customer or to an investor, the idea to an investor. So that slice of money was missing, and we supply it through the Rocket Fund through a grant program to help companies build that first commercial prototype that they can demonstrate and test with customers. And in fact, today we're closing our applications for this year. So out of that experience of working with so many entrepreneurs, 20 years of trying to help start companies, we've arrived at the conclusion that in clean tech, it has to happen on a much bigger scale than we've ever thought before. That's the biggest thing. That implies a lot of collaboration and cooperation at the scale that you're actually talking about in the book. The second thing, it has to happen fast. And it's not going to happen fast without that collaboration and cooperation. So that's my start to today.
Perfect, thank you. Great context, Miya and Stephanie.
So we start in on the book, Rob?
Perfect.
Okay, well, so this is the book that we're talking about, in A New Reality, and it refers to this change that we're talking about. It's actually a redesign and a representation of a book that my father and I did back in 1981, and it was it actually came to light again and was republished and redesigned in its current form, and that's what we have to discuss today. This is a picture of myself and my father back in 1981 in our full late 70s, early 80s regalia, and you know, a time that was turned out to be having a lot of foresight for our current era. My father was Dr. Jonas Salk, and he was the developer of the first polio vaccine, which saved millions of lives, spared a lot of illness and injury to a lot of children, and also put him in a position to go on from there and to do other things than just in the laboratory. And one of the things that he did soon after was to conceive of and help design and found the Salk Institute for Biological Studies, which was meant to be a place originally in the original vision where scientists and artists and poets and philosophers could all get together and address the problems of humankind. He had the foresight and wisdom to choose Louis Kahn as his architect. And this is something about my father, which I'm really quite proud is and impressed, is that he took a very active role as a client in the design of this building. And had a great deal of influence on how it came out. And that his ability to kind of leave the laboratory and enter a world of architecture and design is something that was really quite remarkable about him. And the existence of this particular building is really a monument both to Lou Kahn and to my father. What few people know is that he went on in the last third of his life to develop a large number of ideas about the future, about the nature of creativity, and about applying some of the creative thinking that went into the Institute and that went into the polio vaccine to address the broader problems of humankind, like poverty, public health, but also international conflict and increasing the human potential. His wish was that his ideas would continue to be disseminated so that, in a way like a vaccine, it might have the greatest effect on the greatest number of people. And so it's within that light that we're, attempting to continue that work. The basic symbol and the basic form in this book is the sigmoid curve and the sigmoid growth curve. It goes from a period of acceleration to decelerating growth. And my father looked at this and he felt like it's used as a thinking tool throughout the book. And you'll see how that plays in as we go through this. The idea came from looking at the human population growth curve, and here we see the human population from the turn of the first millennia all the way through to the present. And what is just patently obvious is this astronomical explosive growth that's happened in the last 200 to 300 years. That is a result of developments in industry and science and technology, healthcare, and agriculture that's permitted us to sustain a far greater human population than ever before, which has been both a blessing and a problem that we face. But back in late 1960s, early 70s, my father looked at this curve, which was just then at actually 4 billion, and said, well, what's going to happen? Is it going to continue to go up forever? Or, which is obviously impossible. Or will we exceed some kind of limit and see the collapse of the human population? A possibility which was theoretical at the time, but now in our current day and age is just all too palpable, and we live with this every day. Or, he said, would it happen to bend and inflect and reach an equilibrium in the form of the sigmoid curve? And so he looked at this curve and made use of it in a number of ways. Here's an example from a laboratory of a growth of a single organism, this population of fruit flies introduced into a bottle. And again, you see the familiar form of the sigmoid curve, accelerating growth, inflection, and decelerating growth. So what does this have to do with human population and the problems that we're talking about? Well, let's see. Here's a picture of the human population from 1850 to the present. And what you see here is the familiar upturn curve. But if you look closely, you can see that it begins to straighten out here and even begins to inflect and change. And so this change took place in the late 20th century, the late 1900s. And if we take the UN population projections through the end of the 21st century, this is how it looks. And if these projections bear out, we're seeing a plateau of the human population around 11 to 12 billion. So again, we see the figure of the curve. Why does population growth slow? Well, this is a really great story that I like in researching this book, because it turns out the factors that cause people to have fewer children and have smaller families are economic development, sustainable economic development, healthcare, decrease in infant mortality, and in particular, the education and empowerment of women. And I won't go into any details about this, but this is a really remarkable fact, because what it means is it's a real win-win for us, that if we can help people in other parts of the world to develop and to have better lives, it creates better lives for them, but it also slows population growth a little bit faster throughout the world, which benefits all of the rest of us. So this is sort of the meat of the concept. This is the curve, again, that you're familiar with, and we'll see a fair amount of as we continue. But my father looked at this curve and he thought, you know what, it's actually two separate curves. It's a curve in which a period and two separate periods in human history, a period when things were accelerating and growing without limit, to a time that's different where growth is decelerating and reaching an upper limit. The first he called epoch A and the epoch B, which wasn't terribly imaginative, but this is what we're left with. But it doesn't take much to see that the world looks very different to someone who was born and lived in epoch A and to someone who was born and lived in epoch B. And that what was advantageous in a particular period of time is disadvantageous in the next period of time. The most obvious example of this, it has to do with limits and consumption and waste and the use of natural resources. In epoch A, there were no limits. We could consume without any concern for using up the resources, and we could dispose of waste with apparently no consequence. And that change really beginning about the 1960s, 1970s through the end of the 20th century, where it became clear that we were reaching our limits, where we needed to conserve and sustain. And so that our values really began to shift and are still shifting in this respect. Now, this doesn't only apply to resource use, it applies to human behavior and how we get along and how we relate to each other. In Epoch A, when things were increasing without limit, and there seemed to be no problem with acquisition of things, that period of time tended to be dominated by competition, independence, and power. And those who competed, those who were the most independent, tended to predominate. The countries, the individuals, the corporations. In Epoch B, we're looking at a very different reality. And in order to survive, we actually depend on a whole different set of values, which are collaboration, interdependence, and consensus. And these values will actually result in increased survival and increased adaptation of those who tend to use them. Another difference between the two is Epoch A was a time of persistent expansion. Epoch B is a time heading toward equilibrium. And it won't be necessarily a static equilibrium, but a dynamic equilibrium. But these are, again, two different value systems and two different ways of approaching things. The basic measures of growth and the basic measures of success were throughout Epoch A were economic growth. But in Epoch B, we'll have new measures for this, which have to do with planetary well-being, human and species throughout the planet. And this is a slightly abstract idea, but in Epoch A, those who pursued problems with an either-or strategy or win-lose strategy tended to predominate and tended to be the most effective. Whereas in Epoch B, an idea of both and win-win become important. And this, again, we'll come back and talk about this with Miya and Stephanie, but these basic changes in how we design things and how we get along and how we approach problems are really very different and are in the process of change. But a change of this magnitude is not going to happen without paradox and without conflict. And when I talk about paradox, what I mean is that in Epoch A, that was a really time where self-interest was served by competition, by acquisition, by independent action, and those serve self-interest, and that's easy to see. What's interesting is that when we change to Epoch B, and we're looking at different values and more humane values and attitudes and behaviors, those, interestingly enough, serve self-interest as well in the very different environment, in the very different situation in Epoch B. Another way of putting this is in Epoch A, there was this tremendous transition and tension between what was pragmatic and what was humane. And so the ideas of environmental care, the ideas of looking at the rights and the welfare of people in the distant parts of the planet or different socioeconomic strata, that was all very well and good. And it was kind of hand waving, and that was morally right and seemed to be, the way we should live our lives. But it wasn't pragmatic. It wasn't profit making. It wasn't worthwhile to make those changes and to do those things. In Epoch B, it's actually a very different situation because what is pragmatic turns out to be what's humane. What helps us survive, what helps increase profit is more the humanitarian ideals. One small example, actually large example of this has to do with in the area of renewable energy. When it first came along, this was just a niche idea. This was just an idea that was wildly expensive, not practical, and deserved little attention on the part of a lot of people. Now that we're in the new situation that we're in, this is really literally shifting, and it's really literally shifting as we speak. And we're really going from a time where those we're really entering a time where it's clear that in the long-term planning, investing in developing renewable energy will be profit-making and will be advantageous in a whole lot of ways throughout society. And I'll just sort of say it from a personal perspective, it's just so exciting to see this play out, because this is the kind of thing that we talked about literally 40 years ago. And it's really, one of the reasons I redid the book was I sort of woke up every day and looked at the paper and went, oh my gosh, this is really happening. What a nice surprise. So we'll come back and talk about it some more. The other thing that's quite useful about this, and this is a useful slide for me, and I think for a lot of people, is that if we look at where the point of maximal tension and the maximal conflict is going to be, it's right at that point of inflection, which is exactly right where we are historically. We're right there. And this helps explain the kind of polarization and the difficulty that we're having in society, throughout our society, throughout American politics, and throughout the world. Because we're at a time of uncertainty. We really don't know where things are going to be and where things are going. And what tended to work in the past isn't working anymore, and what's going to happen. Now, it makes sense, looking at it from this point of view, that a whole lot of people are looking at this and just going, oh my gosh, we don't know what's happening. Let's go back and reinforce the problem, the solutions and the way that we approach things in the recent past, because we have we're in danger, and let's go back and cling to the things that worked before. And it makes sense to me, looking at it from that there's a whole population of people, which is huge, who are basically looking at things and being, that's the emotional reaction. There is, however, a large mass of people, and I think what will soon be a critical mass, who are saying, no, what we need to do is see what the future is, appreciate what the conditions are going to be, and adapt to them. And in order to do that, we have to come up with new ways of being, new ways of relating, new ways of problem solving. But we need to move forward, and that's the way through this. But that particular tension is, I think, literally being played out, every day in so many ways. But the other thing that's helpful, if you look at this in the short term, 1, 3, 5, 10, even 20 years, this is what it looks like. It basically looks like we're doomed, we're screwed. We've got no way around this. And this is how it looks in the morning sometimes when I wake up and I turn on the news, or I look at the news. And I certainly have many days where I just go, this what's going on? This is just awful. But if you use the perspective and the long-term perspective of the sigmoid curve, this puts it in a context that makes it much more handleable and much more hopeful, really, because we see that this is part of a natural evolutionary and a developmental process, and it's actually expected, and it's anticipated, and that there's a way out of it. And the way out of it is to continue to follow the curve and to go forward into the future. This slide is just here to remind us that even though this nice looking curve looks like it's inevitable, that we're going to end up at an equilibrium at a higher point in human development, it's not at all. This is not a given. There is what we know now in every way, that there's a danger that if we cling to the values of Epic A too long and don't move into and develop the ideals of Epic B, that we run the real risk of exceeding planetary limits and having a decimation of the human population and other species, from famine, from disease, to interhuman conflict. So this is not at all a given, and it's really up to us, and we have a lot to do to make this transition happen in a successful way. So just spend a couple of minutes on the resolution and integration and kind of where we go from here, using this perspective. This is a critical period, and we actually all are responsible for guiding society and the species to a new equilibrium. and we'll come back to this, but everybody has a part in this. Everybody really has a different role at whatever level we're on, at the individual all the way up to the societal and the planetary. And one way of looking at this is that we're moving from a time where there was increased specialization, to where there was increased tension, and a period of where things were either one way or the other. And we're moving into a time that's integrative. It's a reintegration of resources, of power, of ways of problem solving, and even within academia, the overlap of different the overlap and the integration of different disciplines. One just clear example of this is we went from a period where it was just consumption or conservation and not knowing which was which, and there was a tension between them. What's resulted in something that didn't exist when we first wrote the book, but has really come to being in the past 30 or 40 years, is this whole concept of sustainability, which is really an integration of consumption and conservation in a creative and positive way that allows us to sustain and to live on a planet in which there are planetary limits. Another area, and this is in terms of academic discipline and human creativity, is that things were really, well, are you a scientist or are you an artist? Do you run by reason or do you run by intuition? Do you run on emotion or cognition? And that somehow, fit the kind of development that we went through with science and technology and the dominance of that in human life and in affecting how we lived in our future. But we're coming into a time where those are, I think, are necessarily, and I think actually becoming integrated in a gradual way. But certainly there's integration between the science and the arts, which not so parenthetically happens in the world of architecture and design, where you see that interface and where those two things are put together. But it's also with a reason, intuition, and as a psychiatrist, I find myself increasingly have an integrative view of, look, it's not either emotion or cognition. These things both happen, and they're really different facets of the same human phenomenon. So, just in conclusion to just the overview, this is going to happen at every level of human endeavor. It's going to happen at the level of the molecular cellular, because we are biological creatures, and changing our behavior and changing the ways that we live and work and relate all happen at that cellular level and at that genetic level. It also will take place at the level of the individual, and the way we all adapt within ourselves. It'll take place at the level of the family and family construct. And I'll just say parenthetically, one of the things, and the level of community and work, and one of the things that we were actually talking about before the call, and one of the changes that's happened with COVID, is people are working in different ways, working from home. And this may be a salutary thing in some ways, because it really alters family structure, and we come around to different ways of relating. And actually, to follow the tangent for a second, when I was thinking about this earlier, I realized that, as human beings, as a species, we always worked at home. For millennia, people worked at home, and they worked in close contact with their families, and this was kind of a natural state. It's only in our recent period of modern development, relatively recent period of modern development, that we've had this kind of, when I think about it, this odd thing of getting up every morning and going to work at some distant place, and these two things, being unintegrated and incoordinated. So we're making that transition, and again, it happens at the level of family, community, and work. that we're looking at different ways of being and different ways of getting along. This also overlaps with architecture and design, because what we need is the design of spaces, the design of built space, the design of open spaces that are going to support this kind of cooperative, this kind of interdependent, this kind of integrative life, that are going to be different. And, you know, architecture design play a huge part in all of this. But just to go on up the ladder, it also is going to require really big changes in social, political, and economic systems. Our political and economic systems have been based for hundreds of years on growth, on the fact that you can look at GDP and see it increasing every year, and that's the basics of classical and contemporary and modern economics. If you think about it, that system is not going to work anymore. We're going to need economic and political systems that are adjusting to slowing growth in epoch B and to equilibrium. And those are going to be very different. And they're going to be based on different values, but they're also going to operate very differently. So we're talking about a big change here. And it's a kind of exciting one. It happens obviously at the international level in terms of resolution of conflict, in terms of how people get along, in terms of equity, in terms of balance of resource and inequities in terms of income and in terms of wealth across classes within countries, but throughout the world, particularly the difference between the northern and the northern and southern hemisphere. So all of that really has to change, and it changes all the way up to a planetary level, which we're very conversant in these days. But it's a very important set of ideas, and this is just to remind us that it actually happens at this planetary level. I'll also say parenthetically, some people that I've been in contact with who really like this concept are some people who've worked with astronauts. And apparently there's this phenomenon that with astronauts go into space and they look back and they see the world as a whole. There is this tremendous effect and a tremendous change in them in understanding how interdependent and how much of a system and what kind of a world we live in. And just, you know, looking at this, it's a totally different sense of what we need to do and how we need to care for ourselves. So in conclusion, just to say that we're moving now from a time where things were known, where it's familiar in what we were doing, to a time where things are unknown. But I really like to think of this not so much as known to unknown, but as the future is something to be created. And this is something for us really to design, that we're in a position of not exactly a blank slate, but a lot of possibility within constraints that we can actually design and create our future in a way that's going to be adaptable. And, you know, architects and designers tend to gravitate to these ideas for just that reason, because that's what the problems of architecture and design are. How do we work within certain limits, and how do we create spaces, and how do we create things that are salutary to the human beings that are going to live in them? So as ominous and as difficult it is, we're really living in an incredibly exciting time, and we have tremendous opportunities for creation of, well, I'll just say it in the last slide, but to really come to realize some of the really higher ideals of humankind, because we're at a point that's really unique in the course of our evolution, where the demands of survival, what we need to do, actually converge with our higher ideals and with the well-being and flourishing of human society. So at this point, it's up to us to see that we navigate this transition, adapting to and emerging in a new reality. So that's my shtick.
Thank you, Jonathan. Excellent overview and really provokes a whole range of questions. And I think to start with our conversational portion, Miya and Stephanie, I'd love for you to address how this focus on limits is changing the focus on what students and innovators and entrepreneurs in your spaces are looking to create. So how is that focus on limits changing what is being created?
You want to go ahead, Stephanie? Want me to?
It's actually expanding in the science arena. It's expanding our imagination, if you like, because for the first time, science discovery is not open-ended. It's got to have real outcomes, because in the case of clean tech and sustainability, as I mentioned earlier, we have to find solutions to climate change very fast. So while we recognize that there's limits on the innovation side, we realize that we have to find new solutions that we haven't found before. So it's expanding, if you like, paradoxically, it's expanding what's permissible, if you like, and what's encouraged within the scientific innovation arena. And there's new programs being put in place to help engineers and scientists move out of their comfort zone of measurement and data-driven evidence, to expand their imagination, to taking more of a risk, if you like, in what they do, and being aware that there should be now an outcome on the global forefront to be able to actually affect climate change. So I see it expanding, actually.
Yeah. In health, we always have limits, I think, on that side, that there are constraints in the way that we design in healthcare. There's constraints on our bodies. There are constraints in, the systems that exist. And I think what we're realizing is those constraints have put a lot of pressure on healthcare. It is exceedingly showing itself as a broken system. There are a lot of inequities. We're hearing about them all the time, and yet also a lot of hope for what's possible now that the world is changing, and changing so rapidly with technology. And we're seeing this with a new vaccine. So that the limitations, like Stephanie said, can be expansive. Like all of a sudden we can realize that what we once thought were problems are now we can respond. And that ties into, I think, as the way that I think about healthcare design. We're moving now to try to adapt, as Jonathan was mentioning, adapt our design mindsets to realize that the way of thinking about design as a process is no longer applicable, or maybe needs to be rethought because of these limitations, that that process is not going to work for every context. And so we've been kind of thinking about it now as design as a practice. And if it's a practice, we can improve it, right? Every practice improves over time. So the way that we're thinking about design within these new constraints is causing us to really say and reflect, is the way that we've done design in the past really working for us? And I'm really inviting in the world of healthcare, as well as in education, to rethink and say we need new approaches, because the old way that we've been doing things may not be working so well. And part of that, I think, is because when we're not consumer focused, when we're not designing things and products to put out in the world, which totally relates to this book, like we're at our limits, I think, with things. I think we have so many things out in the world, and I keep talking about the fact that we might need new thinking, we may need more connection, we may need to rethink our relationships, and in order to think of a more service-focused mindset. How do we care for each other? How do we service with each other? How do we support each other? And we can design that rather than designing more stuff.
I just want to throw in, Robbie, how exciting it is for me to hear about this stuff, because the book does things in broad outlines, but the real work and that are happening, and people like Stephanie and Miya are doing, is applying these ideas and making them work in reality, you know, and in the details. So it's just very cool for me to see this.
Stephanie, what are some of those ways that your students and faculty are shifting their focus? You shared a little bit about a new course in chemical engineering, I think was where it was. And how has that focus starting to materialize in your perspective?
First of all, I have to say and stress that Caltech is very science orientated. It sounds trite, but in fact, there are very few institutions left in the world that are so science focused as Caltech is. So the mindset, as I mentioned earlier, really is focused on basic discovery. But having said that, we are beginning, especially in clean tech and sustainability, beginning to move forward into thinking what kind of impact beyond academic papers and Nobel Prizes and individual efforts can we have as an institution on important problems like medicine, by the way, but also certainly in climate change. So this course that you alluded to is one of the, it may be the first that's been held on campus. It's called Sustainability for Chemical Engineering. And what it covers, it's very ambitious. What it covers is the very broad world perspective, if you like, that's happening around us in climate change, and how you connect what happens, let's say, in China and Brazil with what happens in the Caribbean, for instance. And as scientists and engineers, we have to think about what impact our professional and personal choices might have, because as we graduate from Caltech and we go into positions of responsibility, then before we could just stay within our employment bubble and be happy with producing great science or great products. Now we have to think, well, this might have an impact in a way that we couldn't anticipate before. And so this course really, and I have to thank Julia Kornfeld for putting it together, is amazing, because for engineers and scientists, for the first time, they're first to really consider this. Some of the things that come out of it are astonishing. For example, if I could just take a moment to give you one example that is highlighted in the course. It really talks about a systemic look, if you like, at the world. And if we can bring that into our teaching and into thinking, I think that'll make a big difference. So for instance, China, as the population actually goes up the earning scale, requires more protein or desires more protein. So they're requiring, in fact, that we sow more soybeans, if you like. They're providing a market for more soybeans. And a lot of the Amazonian rainforest is being converted into growing soybeans. So what happens with that kind of agricultural shift is that all of a sudden, this impacts the whole climate around the world. So for instance, we're finding that as a result of agriculture practices, the Sahara, for instance, is putting out more dust. The dust is actually collecting as clouds, believe it or not, back in Costa Rica, for instance. If you actually go out at about 11 o'clock in the morning, you'll see this dirty cloud around haze, if you like. That is affecting the tourist trade on which the Caribbean depends. And guess what? China is a major investor in tourist trade in the Caribbean. So all of a sudden, these consequences that you wouldn't have anticipated are happening very fast and worldwide. And so with systemic kind of thinking, I think that we can begin to move our scientists and engineers into a passionate commitment to seeing the broader world and bringing their talents and their education to be able to affect that broader world. So that's one example. The other one, very quickly, I'll say, is that the Resnick Sustainability Institute, of which I'm a part, has launched what they call small-scale projects. Now, it's a bit misleading because some of these might have a huge impact. What they do is they take the faculty and typically a student out into the real world where they can actually explore it's a basic science question, but it underpins a climate change that's going on. So for instance, one group is being funded to go to Costa Rica again, to actually track the carbon dioxide emissions that happen when there's volcanic eruptions, and they happen fairly frequently in Costa Rica. And what they're tracking is the impact on the vegetation around the volcano. It turns out that we're actually know relatively little about what a rise in CO2, what kind of impact it will have on plant life. So that kind of discovery will actually be able to be applied elsewhere, but also at the same time, the faculty and the students are going to be there on the ground. They're going to be seeing how change that we're talking about is actually impacting the local economy and how people live. So those are a couple of examples.
That's great. And Jonathan, maybe you could share a little bit about some of the ways in which your father came to grasp these concepts through his work, because I think a lot of the thinking that's going on in moving from the context of the laboratory to the context of the rim of a volcano is part of what he was seeing, this expansion of context that you were seeing as well. And could you maybe give some examples of some experiences that you guys might have had that helped expand your thinking?
Sure. I mean, when it comes to my father, in some ways, it was interesting because he was kind of he was born that way. People used to say to him, like, why can't you do it like everybody else? And he just couldn't. And the other thing is that even with the vaccine, one of the things that he brought to the thinking and the work on the vaccine is that up until he was involved, it was a very academic plotting situation. And it was, about the science in the laboratory. And one of the fundraisers for the March of Dimes was funded the polio vaccine research. When he met my father, he said, at last, I found a scientist who thinks outside the laboratory. So he always was doing that. And again, as I mentioned, the whole concept of the Institute was this merging of the two cultures, which was an idea that C.P. Snow wrote about. And I think the last thing I'll say is that everything was a creative process to him. So that he really did. I mean, one of the books that he wrote was called it wasn't called A New Reality. It was called, the subtitle was A Merging of Intuition and Reason. And that was the nature of reality, was those two things. So he's tremendously invested in interested in the creative process and where that came from and how that could really change the world. So that's not exactly what you asked, but those are the things that come to mind.
That's a perfect bridge, and I think from Miya, from your perspective, how are some of those shifts in looking outside of the traditional context of health and healthcare systems, how are those new ways of looking actually affecting the products and services that are being delivered and invested in today?
I related to what has been said before, when you get out of the lab, when you get out of working within, your world, you realize that people are really at the heart of it. And with healthcare, it's oftentimes we can march along very quickly thinking that we're creating things that are for the good of people, but we forget, at the end of the day that we're all going to be patients. Everybody we know is going to be affected by healthcare. And right now, you know, the importance of working with people that have lived experience, I think, is critical to design. It's something that we've always believed that in medicine, you know, patients were some of the last people they were seen as recipients. And some of even the vocabulary around, you know, fixing and problematizing and pathologizing has made its way into design. Like, we seek problems, then we find solutions to those problems. And I think that, you know, we've been working with a group called the Disabled List, who are really credible thinkers, very emergent thinkers, thinking about building, you know, shaping a new kind of culture around, which would include new language around how we think about experience and identity. And I would also say an example is where there's a group called the Patient Revolution, and they're looking, they're out of the Mayo Clinic. They're looking at how do we create a new clinic that is around careful and kind care. And, you know, we've lost that connection. We've gotten into this mode of, you know, the business models are not supportive of doctors and patients kind of coming together and enriching, you know, what Jonathan's talking about around prevention, around promoting health, around well-being. Those, we've lost that. The institution of health has kind of eroded some of that. And whereas the intention of maintaining someone's health might be there, I think we've lost touch with it. And so the Patient Revolution talks about the connection between biology and biography and how important that is. And at the end of the day, you know, we do a lot of trying to rethink how do we include people with lived experience, the people most impacted, into the conversation, so that we can work in a more, we talk about collaboration and interdisciplinary work, but even in those contexts, sometimes we forget to include people. We're just people who are going to be experiencing this, you know, and so we oversee things that are very complicated, like, you know, institutional racism or, you know, social economic inequities, because it's not in the room. It's just not in the room at all. So, so that's some of, I think, how we're, when dealing with healthcare and dealing with in this sphere of what a shift might look like. I think there's a lot of things that we can approach differently.
And I mean, and that's fantastic, Mia. I mean, that just covers so much. You know, and on the one hand, the humanization of technology is a big part of this, and that's just great, and that things serving human well-being as opposed to serving just the march of progress. And I think the other thing just to say is, you know, it's another shift in from a couple of perspectives, but the emphasis on health and the emphasis on well-being, as opposed to the emphasis being on anti-disease, is huge. And, you know, from the one, but what stands in the way in a number of ways is profit. What stands in the way of what is defined as the short-term goal of, like, how much money can be made. And, you know, idealistically, we need to see a situation in which the measure is well-being rather than the number of dollars. And then the ideal situation is where the two happen to meet and happen.
Yeah, like you're saying in your example, where there's an and there versus an or.
Yeah. And I think that we'll see that increasingly in science and I mean in medicine.
Yeah. The examples that the visualization of the curve and just the articulation of what the future could look like if we think about it and we consider it is just so hopeful. And I know the three of us, Stephanie and Jonathan and Robbie too, we were just talking about, you know, the reassurance of even being able to see it in that way, which I think is such a gift about your book.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I think in clean tech and sustainability, we're a bit more fortunate actually, because everybody's being impacted by it. So that all of a sudden people are being forced to change whether they like it or not. And we also know, though, in conjunction, there have been studies and programs are being moved into place to support this, that we need to draw from a broader pool of innovation than we have in the past in order to achieve these solutions. So we're looking, for instance, at improving the input of diverse communities into the innovation process, which quite frankly hasn't happened before in science. We haven't really looked at that, and now we are saying that not only do they have to be part of the innovation equation, they have to be part of the implementation equation as well. And so in our arena, those barriers are falling away rather fast. And by the way, I came originally from a biotech background. I'm very familiar with what you're talking about, the barriers that are put up. And as consumers, we never had much say in what medicines actually we were allowed to have. But in clean tech and sustainability, we can make big choices, and we can make them fast. Adopting solar, for instance, has happened very fast. So that is something that's going to be very helpful in the future.
Really cool. That's
Yeah.
great.
And Stephanie, actually, to follow in that logic, one of our attendees has a question with regards to the tension between meeting sustainability requirements at a startup level and some of the ways in which that might slow down the investment process or make certain types of investors less interested because they see a barrier towards the near-term ROI. How are you helping the entrepreneurs in your space find those investors and communicate that broader impact on maybe the triple bottom line approach?
Yeah, the member of the audience has highlighted a real challenge actually for clean tech, because quite frankly, it does often take a lot of capital investment and a very long ramp up time. The markets are uncertain as well. So what's happened actually over the past decade, and certainly in the last 5 years, is that the state and federal governments have stepped in to provide funding for that kind of technology proof of principle, and even the prototyping that I mentioned earlier. So there's no substitute for it. Investors come and go, quite frankly. Right now, there are more small investors willing to support earlier stage companies developing in the Bay Area, because they can see, quite frankly, the current administration is going to be pumping a lot of money into clean tech, but they can evaporate and disappear. Whereas steady government funding actually can get these innovations to the point where they can become products. So one thing I would like to say to anybody who's on the call, that we can supply a list of funding sources, if they don't know them already, that can help the earlier stage company actually get through this very difficult, what's called the valley of death, in developing the technology to the point of being a product. And I also want to point out another program. Of course, we all know Bill Gates, and he launched in 2015 something called the Breakthrough Program. It's not a program, it's much bigger than that, with a lot of his billionaire buds, quite frankly, including Jeff Bezos and others. At that point, it was $1 billion fund specifically to support startups in clean tech to solve the climate challenge. He recently closed another round of $1 billion, but he's grown the initiative now to have 5 parts that start with supporting concept. So he supports basic research, moving through applied R&D. There's a fellowship program, in fact, that Caltech and others have been invited to apply for, through to providing money for the scale up, through to investment. And he's willing to look at risky technologies and support them through that whole phase. So that's very promising. It takes leadership of that kind really to make this happen. So government leadership and leadership from visionaries like Bill Gates will help see us through.
Thank you. Thank you. So there are actually audience, we appreciate your questions already, and I think that we'll start to move into some of these. So the question from at the top of our list: how can we build trust in healthcare in this uncertain time? So I think that the question around trust is critical here. What are some of your thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just start us off in thinking about, health is so relational. It's all about relationship, as I've been talking about. And I think that when people don't feel a part of the discussion, you won't bridge that trust. It's a very, a concept that, we can understand in our family units, or maybe not, but in our friend networks. And then when it comes to thinking about, relationships that involves, I think, also power. There's a power dynamic in healthcare, where doctors may know best, or that we feel like maybe we were kind of misled by in our health. I think that's the disconnect, and we haven't spent time again to really think about that. And I think the invitation of working from communities and thinking about, I think it both comes from leadership, as you said, Stephanie, and then also from listening, and would love to see more of that happening, so that the people, we've been talking about this concept of the who and the how, which I like, because same letters but just differently, and just making sure, like, who is in the conversation as we start to talk about these things. Do we have the right people there? And then how are we going to engage with them? Because it's more than just putting people in the room and saying we're gonna have a session where we listen to you. It needs to, again, sustain. We have to figure out what of our approaches that will sustain relationships, so that we can start to bridge and connect. And I think that's what's broken right now, is the connection. We're not hearing people. We haven't really gone into the communities to really understand what's happening and listen to the communities and finding out what's going on. So if there's a racism component, or if there is, some kind of vulnerability in the community, being able to see that and bring that into the conversation is critical. It's critical, and it's hard. It's hard work, and we need different ways of doing that, because I think some of our old ways may create more harm than we intend. That makes sense.
And Stephanie, that question of trust plays out so much in the laboratory and in the research context of faculty and students and postdocs all participating in a very finely defined pathway. How have you been helping the participants understand the goals and motivations, and maybe trust each other to take a risk outside of what might be the norm?
That's a really good question. At Caltech, everything is typically led by the faculty. It is so at most universities, but at a small place like Caltech, it's even more so. So we have a group of faculty that have been interested in entrepreneurial ventures, and seeing that as one way, if you like, to have the innovation, have an impact in the world outside, a different way than through the academic performance. So, for instance, I don't want to name them all, but Frances Arnold, for instance, is one. She's a Nobel Prize winner, and she started the research that won the Nobel Prize from the perspective of what kind of impact is this going to have on the real world outside. So that was one of the reasons she got the Nobel Prize. But she's only one of a core group of faculty that are kind of beginning to change the culture, if you like, and make it allowable for students to think about that as an alternative career option for them. By putting or implementing a course on entrepreneurship for the first time at Caltech that will be broader than just starting companies. It's going to be allowing students to look at other options to have a real world impact, like going into policy, for instance, into setting government policy. We think that we'll be able to have Caltech alumni have an even bigger impact than they have before, and allow these kind of channels to give them permission, if you like, to do that. I just wanted to go back to what Miya was saying, the challenge of reaching out to communities. We face the same thing in the technology world. You know, we live in our bubble, and there's been this prescribed path forward that you develop technology, you form a company, the venture capitalists come in, you sell a product, you sell a company. And in clean tech, it doesn't work that well. I've already mentioned about investment not always being there, but it needs the buy-in of the communities that you're serving in order to make the clean tech innovations really work on the ground, if you like. So I just wanted to call out the state government programs. There's one called EPIC that's supported by or funded by the California Energy Commission. $130 million a year is put into applied R&D and helping companies develop their product. Fully 35% of that has to go towards underserved communities or low-income communities in those proposals. And I'm very proud of the fact that California has decided to do that. There's a good deal of self-interest there because resiliency, as we've seen with the wildfires, is really important. We have to be able to have storage on hand, for instance, to be able to supply power when the grid goes down. We need to be able to service the healthcare clinics that are working with those areas, the rural areas, the underserved areas as well. And they are maybe the first impacted when the grid goes down. So this kind of, I mentioned earlier, the idea of looking at systemic integration is hidden, is buried in this kind of actions, if you like, but it's having a real world impact in the kind of funding that we support.
Just
Exciting.
Yeah.
No, it's really great. And just an anecdote on the issue of trust is how different things are now than they were in 1955 when the polio vaccine came out. And there's been a real shift in that. I mean, people, didn't have to sign, for the trials. Everybody signed up without a whole lot of informed consent. It was just a note card that says you have the permission to give this vaccine to my child. And there was compliance with it, and what we're seeing with the COVID vaccines is huge numbers of people who don't trust it and who are not going along with it. I think Miya's really on the right track. That certainly in the delivery of healthcare and the design of healthcare, taking into account people is is obviously kind of a revolutionary idea. And how we can get to that on a more societal level, I don't know, but it's something along the lines of really understanding the people that these things are being delivered to, and tailoring it and finding out what their concerns are and listening to them, rather than just kind of going, well, you're stupid.
It's transactional very fast, and I think with transactions, they don't happen without trust. Otherwise, we're just checking a box, and it's I don't know if it's sustainable for us, and we're seeing things kind of, we try something and it doesn't work, and we have to try it again. But I hope that we can build that resilience and in our approaches.
Yeah.
Can
There's
I ask a question? Oh, sorry.
Oh.
Yeah.
I was curious on Stephanie. Are you the thing that design has been very interested in is kind of the iterative process that I think came out of science, and thinking about how do we prototype something and iterate on it. And I'm curious if the how things have shifted, or how if that is still, you know, kind of dominating science in terms of thinking about innovation.
Absolutely. In fact, there's a program called Lean Launchpad. I don't know if people are familiar with it. It spawned a major national program called the I-Corps program that's funded by the National Science Foundation, that is based on the iterative process of science discovery. So the way it works is it takes scientists and engineers that are still developing applied technology, but know nothing about business. They know nothing about discovering customers, their customer markets, and it takes them through a pretty intense boot camp, 8-week boot camp, where that's all they do, is they take their technology, they cold call maybe 100 potential customers or collaborative partners, and through that kind of iterative process, they come back, they change the technology, they go out again, they begin to shape it in a direction that might be commercially possible. So for sure, that is a very good example, and it's worked very well, by the way. There have been a lot of companies that have gone on and received major investment out of that very preliminary start. And we've tended to want to incorporate that into the programming that we're doing at Caltech. I mentioned the Rocket Fund that we run, which provides grants for prototyping. It's not a program that's run not just for the winners. We provide mentoring and connections where they may not win an award, but they can go back and over the next year maybe talk to these mentors, iterate their technology, decide maybe what it should really be, and they can come back and apply again. So it's also an education and learning experience. And these competitions, we supported a competition called Flow before that was funded by the Department of Energy. Again, there was a huge educational component for the students who were starting companies to be able to iterate their technology in front of several panels of judges. So with that kind of practical guidance, they could begin to develop it in a new direction. So absolutely, it's having quite a strong impact, if you like, in how we look at innovation.
Thanks.
I'm just going to, what comment I was going to make, because I keep coming back to Mia's, the dilemma, and also what has to happen, which is bring in the community. And that is, it's really challenging for science institutions to do this for obvious reasons, because the science process is so prescriptive, if you like. But I just want to call out two universities, Northwestern and Rice University, actually, that have built into their entrepreneurship program workshops and other connectors. Sometimes it's actually project workshops, project proposals that bring in the outside community, brings in actually the artists that are actually on campus, that brings in the community in their various cities, for instance, in Houston, to share, if you like, in the discovery process with the entrepreneurs. Those are baked into their business models and baked into the business schools that are supporting entrepreneurship. It was interesting because I did a survey of 5 universities as I'm looking at what we should do at Caltech. Those were not that common, that kind of bringing in the outside community. But we're seeing in clean tech and sustainability that we definitely have to do more of that. So when we come to beginning to think about putting something together on campus, that will be definitely part of what we bring into our thinking as well.
Yeah. There's some great thinking and methodologies around, how do you convene people? We've been at the Design for Social Innovation, we've been thinking about, we're going to have a course in the summer in community design that's led by an instructor named Sloan Leo. And, just to understand, how do we bring people together? And I love the idea of it being interdisciplinary. Like, we may not be able to use the same process necessarily if you think about the communities, right? Because it may not be language that they understand not in a an academic sense, but in that it's not just a part of the culture, right? It's not something that they understand in the way that our communities function. And so I think, my question around the innovation cycles is that, sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. And I'm looking for ways to maybe disrupt it or adjust it. I'm cognizant that sometimes we go in with this iterative mindset, especially in healthcare, and that could create, some negative repercussions or negative consequences. And so trying to be thoughtful in how, again, we do this work and what new practices could we embrace.
The one thing about the I-Corps program, I think it has to change its focus a little bit when it comes to clean tech. By the way, it serves the medical, so far it served the medical community very well. But in clean tech, historically what it's done is it's sent these faculty and students out to talk to, let's say, industry partners, potential industry partners, strategic partners, or to entities that would actually buy the product. I think now they have to start sending them out to talk to the community representatives as well, to see how that these technologies are going to be implemented. Now, I haven't actually heard whether in fact they're going to start introducing that. Perhaps they've done it in the past, but certainly in the California context where it's so important, our prospective companies would have to start looking at that as well, and early. They would have to start thinking about talking to government about the legislation that's coming down, because that's going to impact their innovations as well, and how fast they're adopted, how quickly they can raise investment. So there's a lot of broader thinking that has to go into that. Yeah. So if I was going to adopt, in your case, if I was going to suggest that you look at the I-Corps program, definitely I would include that broader perspective.
Yeah, for sure.
And this is, again, all in the broader context. What you're talking about is that, and this comes back to the trust issue a little bit, is that things developed where it was basically things were top down, where you made a single size that fits all based on a skewed version of who everybody is, without taking into account who the people are in the community. Mm-hmm. And so really changing from that top-down approach to at least a more even approach that includes, things on an equal plane between the innovators and the consumers and the receptors of it, can make a huge difference. It's very great.
Design has a reckoning with that too, because I think design has always come from this point of view of like, I'm going to invent this. And even when we do listen sometimes to, we do interviews, I come from a research background, being able to really ask ourselves, is that true collaboration? Or did we just, ask some questions, check the box, and move on with what we were going to do anyway, right?
Right.
I really like the conversation here, and your about us really kind of taking a step back and saying, if we're required to make a shift in our values, which will include listening to our communities, how do we get to that place that you're describing in this new reality, where our values shift from the individual and the single inventor to something that's shared and collaborated with in a sustainable way.
Yeah, that's great.
I think that maybe brings us to a question in the Q&A, which is, what are some of the skills or knowledge areas that designers and scientists and innovators need to be thinking about that collaboration?
Robbie, I didn't catch the end of the question.
For a moment, Robbie.
There was a little glitch.
Just what are some of the skills and areas of learning that designers and scientists and innovators might look to in order to facilitate this type of collaboration? What are some of those outside of the curriculum types of experiences or approaches to bring to the table, and even in a professional way, in bridging those needs?
Well, at the risk of sounding rather simple or simple-minded, when you, and I was a scientist, as I mentioned, by training, we're brought up to be comfortable in a fairly narrow world, although it can have a potential impact. So just simply actually being comfortable in talking to or reaching out to strangers is extremely difficult. And as I say, it sounds simple. Well, you just learn how to be able to pick up the phone and call people, or of course in other ways now. It's not. That kind of emotional and cultural shift is huge. And I've noticed over the years that I've been working with entrepreneurs, that's number one in the challenge that they have in transitioning, if you like, into becoming an entrepreneur, is being comfortable in taking on risk and certainly talking to strangers about what they're doing. The other thing in our case is how to encourage them to think beyond their technology and what it can do and the power of it, to what the impact might be. Again, in dealing over the years with so many entrepreneurs, I said 1,000, more than 1,000, that's the biggest challenge that they face. Despite the fact that we give them a lot of skills on how to put together a company, how to evaluate a potential customer base, they still cling on to the idea that the technology is going to drive the eventual future of the company. The technology alone will do it. Getting them to move over and thinking on the other side about the potential customer, or in this case, the community, and what it needs and how it will be adopted, is a huge cultural shift. It takes a long time sometimes. Sometimes it doesn't happen. So those are kind of soft skills, but they really underpin how successful an entrepreneur is going to be in getting his innovation to have an impact through forming a company, maybe.
Well, and actually to bridge that with another question that's really focusing on communication within healthcare, how, and Miya, this will be geared towards you, how do those understandings of the communities that are being served, or the focal point of a potential innovation or new medical product, what are some of the ways in which the designers and entrepreneurs and inventors need to think about the language that they use? What are some of those processes and practices that they can use to expand that communication?
Yeah, I like the shift of, into thinking about our language in a more cooperative manner, and to use some of the language from the book around interdependence versus, I think that when we, and kind of asking ourselves, like, is our language like rooted in power? And if it is, because it might be, where are the origins of that, and learning where it comes from, because here in the U.S. it's very strong, and so questioning what other cultures or other places can we find language that is more interdependent. I think we had a wonderful and incredible designer named Sadie Redwing come, who's an Indigenous designer, and kind of asking us to really make space for a different type of practice. I also wanted to just say that, like, I think that diversity and being more inclusive in our language and more generous in our language would get us in a different place. I think that we need more diversity in our leadership so that young people will feel like they can get there. we need people with lived experience on our design teams. So if you're designing for a disease or a community or a disability, that just having people on your team, not just looking at it as another group to bring in, or a stakeholder group, I think that might shift some of the way we think and the way we talk.
There's totally one other aspect to it, which I would label experience. And beyond life experience, it's the experience of actually being in a room with somebody who's different from you. And somehow really understanding that this is another human being with a different life experience. And as much as that can happen, and it's an interpersonal thing, it's all within the realm of psychology and psychiatry, but it's also in the realm of design, because how can you design systems and how can you design spaces that encourage and make that kind of thing happen as part of day-to-day life, as opposed to never happening or just being a once in a lifetime kind of thing.
That's an excellent point. In fact, we're addressing it by providing red teams of mentors, if you like, around our startups or around projects even. And in those mentoring teams, we're bringing in people with different life experiences.
Cool.
Yeah. To help, again, this shift that I mentioned earlier, away from saying purely technology and into thinking, okay, who is this going to impact and how is it going to impact them?
Wow.
So we have 2 minutes left, and I think that there's a question here that might also be a bridge to some final remarks from each of you, which is that the pandemic and the experience of the last year, more or less, has created some serious mental health challenges, trauma, loneliness, isolation. We've seen the reporting on, all of the impact from negative impact that has occurred. Perhaps what you could share with us as we leave is, what are some of those ways in which we may be seeing an optimistic outcome, ways that we might address some of those challenges over the last year in this type of thinking and move towards the future, knowing that so many have had a really hard time?
Yeah.
So I think one thing just to say at the outset is, one of the things that's so troubling and sobering about this whole experience is how differently it's played out in different classes and at different levels of society. Because I think for a lot of people in our world, in a white collar world, there's been a lot that's positive. When I see in the work with families, having this time away from the distractions together as a family has really been improved relationships within the family. But that's under ideal conditions where people have plenty of space to live, where they're not on top of each other and where they're not poor. So I think that there are lots of positive things that people have experienced, but I think it's important in the context of, this is not the vast majority of people. And I suppose one thing that comes out of it is really understanding and really seeing that the reality of other people's lives in different levels of society, it has a tremendous impact.
I honestly think that that a huge amount of good could come out of this, because it's no longer hidden. Just to your point, it's very easy to sort of gloss over it, especially when the economy is kind of humming around. We've known that inequalities have been increasing since the early 70s,
right,
and we've done nothing about it. The question about the minimum wage is ridiculous, quite frankly, because if you follow it actually just simply on inflation, then it should be $20 an hour, and we're talking about not even getting to 15, and people are on 7.5. So all of these cracks, if you like, in the structure of the society that we live in are for the first time very obvious. It took a pandemic to do it. It's taking climate change to show these cracks. I happen to be optimistic because I think as Americans, we'll find a way through, but we'll do it faster and maybe on time. And so talking about your sigmoid curve, it might actually accelerate the movement towards the hopeful solution that you outline in the book. And perhaps without this, who knows whether we would have reached it.
No, that's a really great point.
Yeah, for sure. And related to that, I think, my message has been that we have to care. We just need more care in general, caring about what's happening, caring about each other, caring about how we approach things. And in that, there's some responsibility. Care is again, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. And so, as us realizing that the responsibility is ours, which, again, to go back to the book, it's like that is so clear as a message that, we can have an impact. So what are we going to do? What are we going to do about it? And so I love that. Sloan Leo, who I talked about with the community design, always says, inherent in the word response is responsibility. And I really, encourage all of us to really take that to heart, that we really have a responsibility to take care of each other and our planet.
And I'll jump in just to sum up those two statements, which is, and the question, the COVID pandemic has created, it's been a terrible crisis, but it also presents, it's sort of thrown things up in the air, and it's presented a real opportunity to do things different. And as Stephanie said, really potentially accelerates our propelling into the future.
Well, I certainly leave with a huge amount of optimism from the conversation, and the fact that we can talk about all of these connected areas in the same type of language, that there is a bridge already being built in an abstract way between all of these areas of specialty, and that almost the modeling of the point of the book, in my view, is in creating a context for people like us that come from, four quite distinctly different backgrounds, to be able to focus our thoughts and attention really on the what might be beyond us, what might really affect our neighbors and our neighbors' neighbors and their neighbors as well, and that the book can be used in that way. I hope that the designers in the room see it as a tool for facilitation, a tool for helping teams chart out change, chart out how that might play out in a, very much a project management or strategic type of way, but really looking at that long-term outcome and the choice of language. I think that the way that the representation of Epoch A values versus Epoch B values helps us change our language and, include those words where they are important. So that's my huge takeaway here. And I hope this conversation continues, beyond the Zoom room and in all of the pockets that it may. And please get in touch directly with Art Center if you have anything that you would like to follow up on. Stephanie will definitely share the list that she mentioned. We will have a recording of this conversation, and the book is available, easy to purchase if you're interested in seeing that further. There's also some amazing content on the website, A New Reality. If you just Google search that, you'll find that right away. So I appreciate you all, Jonathan, Stephanie, and Miya. Thank you for coming to Art Center virtually for this conversation.
Thank you.
It means a huge amount.
Thank you.
And we're lucky to have had you, and hopefully we'll see this spark some next steps in our connected networks.
You, Robbie.
Thank you,
Thank
Jonathan,
you all for the work
being a
you're
leader
doing.
in this kind of thinking.
Likewise.
Yeah, I hope that we can collaborate in the near future.
That'd be great.
Thank you, Jonathan. And
Sure.
we sure do appreciate it. And with that, I'll leave you all, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank
Robbie.
you.